Hey folks, welcome back to Intro to Philosophy. This is Unit 7 on the meaning of life, and today we're focusing on the reading Living Life Forwards by Julian Baggini. So we're continue our discussion of the meaning of life, looking at possible answers. So what we're going to go and do this time around is to do a quick recap, do an overview of what a teleological answer to the meaning of life question might be, go over what it means to live one's life forwards according to Baggini, and then do our usual round of evaluation questions, where I can't tell you what to think, but I can hopefully inspire some things for you to wonder about. So, quick recap. This unit we're talking about the meaning of life. That is, our main question is, what is the meaning of life? What's the purpose for my life? What sort of things was I born for? What's the reason why we're here? And in particular, we're talking about whether there is a meaning of life and what sort of possible answers could there be? What sort of meanings? What sort of places could one find meaning? And so previously, we've talked about the purpose of life being to live well. That is, that the meaning of life, the purpose of life, is to live the best life that you can, to live a happy and fulfilled life. And we looked at a couple of classical ancient Greek answers to what that is. We looked at Epicureanism, which says that in order to live well, one ought to pursue a life of moderate hedonism, in which we pursue pleasure to a moderate degree, but mainly we avoid disturbance and we avoid pain. We also looked at Stoicism, which argues that to live well, one ought to live according to reason and to virtue. We ought to learn to take control of those only things in life that are really up to us, namely ourselves and our reactions to things, so that we can best avoid suffering and to live the best possible life that we can. Now, excuse me. Each of those answers focused around the idea that the purpose of life is to live well, to simply do whatever it is that humans ought to do to the best possible way that we can. Now, this go around, we're going to look at a different kind of answer. And just like those two positions, Epicureanism and Stoicism, each pull on and reference some important intuitions that we have, namely that we ought to live in accordance with virtue, or that we ought to just live the best possible life that we can and live a pleasant life. This go around, we're going to focus on a different intuition. This time, we're going to look at and evaluate the plausibility of finding meaning in the pursuit of some goal or in some accomplishment that we might do in life. And to give kind of an illustration of this, I want to take a look at a classic action movie or a Western type scenario. This is something that probably everybody on the planet, thanks to the proliferation of American media and stuff, something that everybody ought to be at least a little bit familiar with. The idea of the lone gunslinger or the hero in the action movie, living with just one purpose in mind, the pursuit and the eventual revenge of himself against some enemy. To pull an example out of Stephen King's The Dark Tower, the gunslinger against the man in black. The gunslinger's only goal in life, the thing that gives all of his life purpose and meaning and drive and makes everything that he does worthwhile, is to eventually find the man in black and kill him. And so there's this one specific goal, there's this accomplishment, there's some target, mission in his life that makes everything else worth it. So when the man in black suffers at the hands of people in a certain town, when the gunslinger suffers at the hands of the townsfolk, it's worth it because it's going to eventually get him to the man in black. When he kills the same people of that town, it's worth it, it's meaningful, it's okay because it's in pursuit of the man in black. And we see this sort of thing in movies and in stories and in legends constantly. We see heroes who just want to do this one thing. This one thing gives them a reason to keep on living, even when things get bleak and dark and desperate and all the odds are against them. They have to keep trying in this pursuit of this mission. And it's not just stories that do this sort of thing. This kind of picture, this kind of model for meaning and purpose, we see this in ordinary life as well. Perhaps it's not as dramatic as the gunslinger chasing the man in black across the desert, but it ends up being something more like, I want to become famous. I want to make my name known across the world, or I want to earn a certain kind of lifestyle, or I want to have a whole bunch of kids, or I just want my father to love me again. There's all sorts of these goals and these things that sort of give people the drive and the purpose to accomplish things. And this kind of picture we can call a teleological account of life's meaning. Now, this is one of the few pieces of actual technical jargon that comes up in this unit. Teleology refers to a study or an account or a theory that has to do with ends and goals and aims and accomplishments and that sort of thing. The Greek word here is telos, literally meaning like an end or a goal or a target. So if an archer is aiming at a straw target at the end of an archery range, that target is his telos. When an acorn is planted into the ground, and it will eventually grow into a large oak tree, the oak tree is the telos of that acorn's life and its growth. It's the end or the thing that it strives to try and achieve. So when we talk about teleology, we're referring to and just talking about goals and ends and accomplishments and that kind of stuff. Now, if we talk about a teleological theory of meaning or a teleological account of meaning, then we're trying to explain and talk about the meaning of life, the purpose of life, in terms of goals and ends and aims and accomplishments. In other words, achieving or pursuing that goal will be the thing that gives life meaning, that gives life purpose. And like I said, we see this sort of thing in stories all the time, but we even see it in ordinary life. Even if we want to get away from the big life picture things like having a kid or becoming famous or I want my father to love me, we often use this kind of reasoning to give purpose to a lot of uncomfortable periods in our lives. Now, for one, I do not endorse the picture with regards to the example I'm about to give. I think you should actually enjoy your college experience, and I think it's worthwhile doing it just in and of itself. Education's a wonderful thing. Stay in school, folks. But I'm sure that for a lot of you, college is actually a difficult period that is only worth it because you're going to get something out of it. You've got some sort of a goal at the end of your 4 or 5 or 6 years or whatever that really is going to make all of these dumb classes and all the long nights of homework and all the technical issues with a class that are going to make it all worth it. The degree is the thing that gives purpose to all of those long nights and too much Red Bull and whatever else you might do to get your work done. All of that suffering, you might say, is made meaningful by the goal. The goal gives it this sense of purpose and worthwhileness. It makes it worth it. And overall, this is a fairly intuitive and common idea of meaning. We use it for short periods in our lives, like with college or some other short period of suffering, but we also do it for the whole of our lives. A lot of people pretty much live their entire lives. They'll go decades upon decades doing things in pursuit of some particular goal or trying to achieve some aim, some end, some thing that's going to make it all worth it. Some folks live for retirement, everything they do, so they can retire early, live in this certain place, and do this sort of thing. Their job, their school, everything they do is worth it. It's got to be given a purpose. It's given a meaning, some significance because of that kind of goal. And the same is true for pursuing certain jobs or even more long-range ideas like the concept of an afterlife. And to a certain degree, concepts like heaven or unification with the Godhead or some sort of a reward-like afterlife can fall into a teleological picture if achieving that goal and finally getting to that state is what makes everything else you go through worthwhile and meaningful and significant. And this sort of idea, this teleological theory of meaning, we could call living forward to a certain degree. That is, human beings who follow this sort of thing live their life forward. That is, they live their life focused on the future, on some future achievement, some future aim. There's going to be something ahead of them that gives meaning to the rest of it. Because you can't really look backwards behind you to meaning very well. Events that happen in your past and try and give significance to everything, that doesn't really work all that well. It doesn't make a whole lot of sense. If some event that happened when I was a child was supposed to give meaning to my life, well, sure, it seems meaningful up to the point it happened, but what about the rest of my life? Where is the significance of that? If the most meaningful event in my life happened, say, when I was 15 years old, well, what happens to the remaining 60 years that I've got? Or is all that just non-important fluff? Is the majority of my life there? So looking backward doesn't make sense for meaning. So a lot of folks tend to try and look forward. They think some future state will be the thing that gives purpose and significance to their lives. And like I said, this seems to be a fairly intuitive and common idea. A lot of folks have this sort of like pre-philosophical version of this view, one where they've not worked out some of the details or thought about the implications. So really, the idea shouldn't seem all that strange. It shouldn't be too hard to grasp. Maybe the terminology or particular examples might be things to ask questions about. But overall, I think the picture's fairly intuitive. And so it's this sort of picture that Baggini wants to talk about in his Baggini discusses overall the plausibility of this kind of view. He doesn't want to just outline and say, yes, this is the way to find meaning in life. He wants to take it and evaluate whether or not this sort of view actually works, to hold up to scrutiny. So in order to do that, he starts analyzing, well, what kind of goals could you use? What sort of goals could give meaning to life? And so little things like, say, getting to wash your car next Tuesday, or it's coupon day on Saturday, or that sort of thing. That sort of thing doesn't actually end up making your life meaningful. Small and nearby goals have the same problem that goals in your past might do, because they don't really give a whole lot of significance. They don't do enough to draw you forward and give meaning to your life overall. Especially things that are useful for trying to accomplish something else. For example, suppose that you're somebody who thinks that getting a college degree is really going to make all of your life worthwhile. Or even if you just want to focus on the period of college, getting that diploma will be the thing that makes all your 4 years of hard work and study and everything else worthwhile. Then you start wondering, well, why do I want the diploma? Why is the diploma valuable? And if you say something like, well, it's because it helps me get a job, well, the diploma is not actually giving a whole lot of significance to your life. It's the job, maybe, that's giving the significance to this period in your life. So the point here is that not just any sort of goal could really give significance to life. It has to be something that's intrinsically valuable. We talked about the difference between intrinsically and instrumentally valuable back with our Why Be Moral piece when we read Plato and the Republic. Baggini argues that only an intrinsically valuable thing could actually give any sort of meaning to life. Because the things like, the small instrumentally valuable things that are valuable because they lead to something else, they're not really doing a whole lot of work in the meaning business. They're just sort of passing the buck on to something else. And you can't even chain together a whole lot of instrumentally valuable things forever and find meaning in your life either. Because then all you're doing is you're just striving for the next little thing in the chain. You've never given your life as a whole any sort of significance or meaning or purpose. You're just jumping from non-significant thing to non-significant thing. So, Baggini and Aristotle would both say the only sort of thing that might work for a teleological theory of meaning would be something that's an end in itself, something that's intrinsically valuable, something that's worth pursuing in and of itself without regard to anything else it might lead to. And to illustrate this sort of thing as to why the other sorts of goals might not work, Baggini makes a comparison to kids asking why. Little kids, they go through a questioning phase. I think between 2 and 5, something like that. I don't know. I'm not a developmental psychologist. I'm not a specialist on child development, unfortunately. But most kids, or at least a large number of kids, go through this questioning phase where they ask why to everything. You tell them something, they ask why. You give an answer, they ask why. Why is the sky blue? Because yada yada. Why? Yada yada. Why? Yada yada yada. You end up finally getting frustrated and that sort of thing. In those sorts of situations, the kid doesn't really understand the full scope of things, so they keep asking why forever. They can keep asking why forever. Eventually, though, you, as the parent or the adult or the person providing the answers, eventually you're going to get frustrated. The kid can't just ask why forever. Like, sure, they're capable of it and they're willing to, but eventually the why stops making any sense because some things are just, self-evident or obvious, or there's no reason why it is that way. It just is. Things that we might call brute facts or primitive facts or notions or concepts in the philosophy business. There has to be something that stops the why chain, the chain of explanation, when you're telling the kid all the answers they're looking for. And the same sort of thing is true when you're looking for meaning, Baggini says. Instrumentally valuable states or goals or accomplishments are like the middle parts of that why because chain. They're the things that, you can answer a question, but you can still ask a further question of, well, why is that the case? In the discussion of meaning, you can do something by saying, well, why is that worth it? Why should I do that? And so long as you can still ask about whether or not that thing is meaningful or significant, you've not really finished your goal. You've not come to the final thing that's going to give your whole life meaning. So, like, say, if I start talking about, my life's significant because I'm going to get a job. Well, why does that make your life significant? Well, because once I have a job, I'll be able to do things I like and earn money. Well, why is that significant, you might ask? You start saying, well, getting money is going to give my life significance because then I can eat fancy meals. Well, why would you want to eat fancy meals? Well, because I really like steak and lobster. Well, why do you like that? Because steak and lobster are just wonderful foods. And that's an example of the kind of thing that Baggini's talking about. And when we talk about that sort of chain in terms of meaning and purpose and everything else, we can start to see that those intermediate parts of the chain, things like, well, I want to get money, or I like eating fancy meals, I want to have a job, none of those actually do any work for providing meaning to the rest of our lives. They don't give enough significance to really make it worth pursuing all this sort of thing. You need something that's valuable in and of itself in order to stop the chain and provide meaning down the rest of it. Or so Baggini argues. So, does this sort of view work? Does the idea of a teleological theory of meaning work? Or some goal ahead in your future is the thing that can provide purpose and meaning and significance to your life? Baggini says no, at least not in any of its recognizable or intuitive forms. In particular, it's got a couple of really big problems. The first one that Baggini points out is that if goals are what give meaning to life, then looking endlessly to the future does us no good. So suppose that I argue that my life is significant because there's some massive achievement that I eventually am going to accomplish, or that I want to accomplish. Like, say, I want to turn the entire world into a collection of philosophers. I want everyone to see the significance of philosophical questions and be reflective and wise people. If that's the case, and if that's the goal that's supposed to give my life meaning, you can ask, well, does your life really have all that much of a purpose? Like, is there a lot of significance in that? And one possibility, like one's very serious possibility, is to say that no, my life isn't going to get any sort of significance from that, because I'm never going to achieve that goal. If that goal stays endlessly in my future, then I never actually am going to achieve the thing that gives it meaning. If we assume that the goal is going to be the source of meaning, which is just the generic form of the teleological theory, then if I never achieve the goal, then my life never actually accomplished the criteria that would give it meaning. If I say my life will have significance if I can just make everybody philosophers, well, if I never achieve that, then I've never met the first part of that condition. So at least on its simple form, the idea of a goal being always in the future, that's not going to succeed well enough to give my life meaning. And this is true even if we live forever, because again, based on the assumptions of this part of the theory, or this version of the theory, if the goal stays forever in the future, then living longer just drags out the length of time that I have for meaningless existence. If I live 70 years and I never achieve the goal, if it's always in the future, then no, I've not achieved meaning. If I live for 100 years, and the goal is always in the future, I never achieve it, then no, I've never achieved meaning. And so on and so forth for any length of time you want to talk about. But even if we do achieve the goal, Baggini says, the teleological view still doesn't work or make much sense. Because then we can start asking, what happens after we reach the goal? If we want to talk about our initial example, the gunslinger and the man in black. Suppose that the gunslinger finally catches the man in black and shoots him. And at that point, usually the movie ends, because directors or authors or whoever's coming up with the story, they usually don't like to leave things undone or anything like that. There's a good sense of accomplishment when the bad guy's taken care of or when the goal's accomplished, so that's a good point to end the movie. You extend it just long enough to wrap up any loose ends, and then roll credits. But in real life, that's not where things end. If I finally achieve my goals in life, if I finally make enough money, if I finally get the right sort of job, if I can finally accomplish the things that I wanted to accomplish, what happens afterwards? Life keeps on going where the movie would normally stop. So we have to ask, what happens to the gunslinger after the credits roll? What happens to us after we finally accomplish the thing that's been giving us meaning? And usually, we don't do so well. Psychology backs up the idea that people who are extremely goal-oriented often feel empty and unfulfilled and kind of lost after they finally achieve their highest ambitions. If my entire life has revolved around getting a certain kind of job, when I finally get that job, I kind of have to wonder, so what now? I've done everything. I've done everything that I ever wanted. And if I have bigger goals than that, if my goal wasn't to get a job, but say to get revenge for my family or to become famous or something like that, accomplishing it doesn't necessarily give the rest of my life meaning. For however much longer I live, all of that time afterwards just kind of seems pointless. Maybe I should have just died after I finished whatever it is that I was doing. Surely we don't want to endorse that sort of view. Anything where you start advocating suicide for people is going to be pretty morally bleak and unreasonable. So, finally accomplishing one's goal doesn't seem to make a whole lot of sense as a source of meaning either. Because if a goal is going to be a source of meaning and we finally accomplish it, sure, maybe the period of life up to the goal is significant. What about afterwards? And more goals doesn't necessarily solve anything. We either just repeat the process of a small, significant amount of time, accomplish the goal, and then being lost again, or we actually fall prey to the previous issue where the goal is always out of reach. Because so long as I keep adding goals to my life, I'm either going to achieve them and thus have a non-significant or a meaningless life afterwards, or eventually I'll die having not fulfilled one of the goals. There'll be still some mission unfulfilled. If it's that mission or that accomplishment that was supposed to give meaning, then I've never satisfied the criteria that gave my life significance. So, strictly speaking, a theory of meaning that revolves around accomplishing goals or achieving ends or accomplishing something, gaining some accomplishment, so long as that's the only criteria for meaning, the theory doesn't work. Either you don't achieve it and you never actually fulfill the conditions for a meaningful life, or you do achieve it and there's still some large portion of your life that seems meaningless and purposeless and just worthless. And neither of those are satisfying answers or satisfying possibilities if we're really trying to consider this as a possible theory of meaning. And Baggini further illustrates this sort of problem and this sort of tension using some ideas from the Danish philosopher Søren Kierkegaard. Now, Baggini goes into more detail with this than I will. But Kierkegaard generally writes that human life can be split up into two different spheres. There are two different, at least, two different major areas that people do stuff in. The ethical and the aesthetic. Now, the aesthetic parts of our lives are just the fleeting sensory experiences. It's like stuff in the moment. It's like when I eat or drink or feel something or experience something, I'm living life in an aesthetic way. If that's my main focus, then I'm living life at that time in an aesthetic way. The ethical dimension of life, I guess dimension of life is the right way to talk about these. The aesthetic dimension of life is going to be our fleeting sensory experiences. The ethical dimension of life is that aspect of life that has to do with long-lasting ideals like justice or learning and education or progress or doing the right thing and being nice to people. Like they're big, long projects or long-lasting, enduring ideals. And Kierkegaard doesn't talk about these two dimensions to life as being like separate things we have to choose between or anything like that. Instead, Kierkegaard's trying to simply describe two of the big ways that we experience and live our lives. Human beings dwell in both the aesthetic and the ethical dimensions of life. The problem that Kierkegaard says is that neither one of these dimensions or aspects of life is really satisfying. Because human beings exist both in specific finite points of time, and we exist over a long stretch of time. If we think about a timeline as being a metaphor for it, and Baggini sort of uses this, if we think of a timeline of our entire lives, with birth at one end and death at the other, we experience life both as a set of finite, single, individual points on that timeline, and as the whole line itself, from start to finish. Because at any given point, I'm experiencing small, finite, temporary things, but at the back of my mind, I'm also thinking about, and I've sort of experienced my life in terms of these big, long trajectories and projects and goals and values and stuff. So human beings experience life in both of these ways: short, temporary, sensory experience way, and long, enduring concept and ideal and value sort of way. But neither of these entirely satisfies us. Even taken together, the two don't really satisfy the full picture, according to Kierkegaard. Now, Kierkegaard has a further element of his theory where he says that one should move beyond both of these two and into the religious sphere of life through a leap of faith and committing oneself to the absurd and the absolute and all sorts of other good stuff. But that's kind of beyond our discussion. Baggini argues that if we're thinking about things in terms of meaning, we can think of human beings as still existing in two different ways along two different dimensions, two different parts of the timeline. We both experience life in terms of finite things, in terms of single individual accomplishments and goals and other things, but also over the course of our long and extended life. And it's that sort of duality of human life that causes us to not be satisfied or find meaning in the accomplishment of goals and other things. Because if I never accomplish a goal, it's like living in the long aspect, the ethical aspect, according to Kierkegaard. I'm looking at the big picture of my life, looking at the whole timeline. But at any given point, I'll never actually achieve meaning because it's always in the future. It's always further out. The big long-term view doesn't really provide a whole lot of satisfaction or purpose or meaning. But neither do the individual finite points. Because individual and single goals, whenever they happen, they don't really satisfy for any longer than the short amount of time in which I accomplish it. The big picture, the further view of the timeline, still views a lot of stuff that I don't have any purpose for anymore. So, Baggini says, if we're going to make the teleological theory of meaning work, if we're going to find a way to explain the meaning of life in terms of goals and accomplishments and that sort of thing, we can't just look for goals that I achieve once and then my life has meaning. We can't be like the gunslinger where one short temporary action is the thing that gives my life purpose. Because we know that doesn't work. Either I never achieve it and my life never actually gets meaning, or I do achieve it and then the rest of my life doesn't have meaning. Instead, what Baggini says we ought to do is try and find some sort of a goal or accomplishment that's a lot more lasting. Something that's an end in itself. Something that, even if it when I do accomplishments, I can keep it going, and I can keep experiencing meaning and purpose and so on. And so he talks about it rather than being a single act or an action or achieving some state, like getting a job or getting that promotion or finally retiring. It ought to be something that's intrinsically meaningful itself, like a certain kind of way of life. If I'm going to make teleological theory work, my goal should be sort of a way of life that's intrinsically and essentially meaningful and purposeful and worthwhile. Since future states that are pushed off into the future won't work, and temporary ones don't either. So instead we should do something that's both. Something that I can achieve and then continue achieving, continue dwelling in. And for a lot of people, this is going to be something like a certain way of life involving a certain standard of living. That's why I've got the nice picture of the house here. One example that Baggini temporarily, briefly considers is suppose I make it my life's goal to eventually retire to the south of France with this wonderful French villa and with pools and gardens and staff and everything else, where I can have wonderful meals and enjoy the company of my family and friends, and just have long days and pleasant nights, in the parlance of the Dark Tower. And so while the idea of, say, having my goal be to eventually retire to southern France, while the idea of that kind of is in the right direction, Baggini still thinks there's a mistake there. We can't actually locate our goal in terms of material things and conditions, because, as we all know, life's complicated. If I'm focusing all of the meaning and purpose of my life in terms of having a nice house, or having a lot of kids, or eating pleasant foods, it's very easy to take away those sorts of things. Houses crumble, economies crash, kids move away or don't like you anymore. Maybe you get a health condition, stop doing these sorts of things. So we shouldn't look for meaning and purpose in terms of material or physical or based conditions or modes of life. These sorts of things don't really work for me either. Instead, Baggini says, we ought to look at ways of life that are sustainable, things that are more enduring even than the material stuff. So we ought to live our life in a certain way that we can keep up, even if circumstances change. We should live virtuously and kindly and well and all the other things that maybe psychology tells us to do. But Baggini ends the piece without really giving us a lot of description of what sort of state we should actually be striving for. In fact, Baggini leaves a lot of questions unanswered. For one, he leaves off the discussion of whether or not it's even possible to find a state like this, something that is enduring and lasting, that we can still try and achieve, something we can strive for and work for and try and achieve, and then keep up for the rest of our lives, so we don't just have that lost, empty period after the credits, where we don't have any significance to our lives. He never talks about whether this is actually possible. He also doesn't consider that maybe the sort of answer he's looking for can actually be found in concepts like heaven or life after death or something like that. Because if that's the case, then the teleological picture gets a whole lot more plausible, or at least it becomes as plausible as any theories of the afterlife do. But Baggini doesn't talk about that. He doesn't consider whether those actually work for this theory or not. And in a more abstract and general way, it also doesn't actually address part of our question again. So just like with the last lecture, we talked about, does living well actually answer things about the meaning of life? Because it doesn't actually address much of the significance side of the question. Well, does this sort of theory, the teleological theory, where we find meaning in our lives in terms of accomplishing goals, or if that's the source of meaning, is that finding meaning or creating meaning? And although that seems like a small semantic, splitting hairs sort of concept, there's actually some big implications there. Because it's still worth asking whether life has its own meaning, whether life is inherently meaningful, or whether we're simply creating meaning, deluding ourselves that there's some significance in an otherwise largely uncaring world. Does life itself have meaning that we find and discover when we accomplish certain things, or are we just creating it when we set goals for ourselves? Or are we lying to ourselves about creating and finding meaning when we accomplish these sorts of goals? These are things that Begini's discussion doesn't touch, and that are still very much worth considering about it. In addition, the teleological theory of meaning, so long as it's about goals and other accomplishments and things that we strive for ourselves, it still doesn't address issues of why we exist in the first place, in particular, why individuals exist in the first place. We might say something like, well, Elon Musk or Bill Gates or Mahatma Gandhi or somebody, their lives definitely had meaning because they had great and wonderful things that they accomplished or that they were trying to accomplish. But what about me? Why does my life have meaning? Why was I born? What purpose does my life have? These are questions that are still very much up in the air, depending on which version or what sort of things you think could give meaning on a teleological picture. And maybe Begini is just simply mistaken about some of his criticisms. Maybe his points don't really capture all of the real value that can be found in one of these traditional or more simple teleological theories. So there's a lot still to talk about that our author and our essays didn't get to. And unfortunately, due to the format of the class, it's rather hard for us to discuss it. So these are all things that I want you to consider further as we talk about the meaning of life and as you think about teleological theories of meaning. So keep this stuff in mind. Maybe spend some time reflecting on it. Your journals should probably help. And I'll see you next time. Happy thinking.